Hello, everybody, and happy Monday. You ready to tie some flies today? Ready to get out there and brave the cold and try some flies? This would be a good fly to use during the winter. The fly we're going to tie today. So um, I hope that uh, I hope that you're all tying up some bugs and getting out there and winter fly fishing isn't always as pleasant as it is other times a year, but you learn a lot. You learn a lot about how to fish colder water and learn a lot about fishing small nymphs and things like that. So, and that's generally what it is fishing small nymphs. So it's a good exercise, and it's character building. It's living outside your comfort zone sometimes, but it'll do you some good. So let's see. Shall we start? I'm going to wait a couple minutes. Welcome, everyone. And if you're new here, shout out in the comments. If you're new, welcome. We do this most Mondays when I'm not traveling. We try to do it most Mondays. And we try to give you fly patterns that will teach you something new. It's just tying any old fly pattern is interesting, but I always try to pick flies that are going to show you a little bit different technique and something you can add to other patterns. So we have Australia in the house, and we have England and Vermont and Warsaw and Washington. Wow. And I know we've got Florida, Missouri, Indiana, New York. Got people from all over the world here today. Well, anyways, welcome. Today in Colorado, Corey. Today we're going to tie a pheasant tail nymph, but it's a little bit different pheasant tail. It's my variation. It's the way I tie pheasant tail nymphs, and I do like the original Frank Sawyer developed pheasant tail. It has a very slim profile. It sinks really well without a lot of added weight, but honestly, it just catches fish, and no one really knows why. But pheasant tail is kind of a magical material, and this fly is tied entirely with pheasant tail. It's got a little piece of copper wire and a couple beads on it. But I do tie my pheasant tails differently than both the original Frank Sawyer version, who he ties all of his with copper wire. He didn't even use tying thread. He used fine copper wire to tie it, and I've done that before, but it doesn't give me enough weight. And if you see a lot of the pheasant tails that you see today are what I call an American pheasant tail, where they have a pheasant tail body, but they have a big, wide peacock thorax, and they have Hungarian partridge legs on them, and they're kind of big and bulky. And to me, a pheasant tail is a great imitation of the smaller swimming mayfly nymphs like blue wing olives. Also, seems to work in smaller sizes. Seems to work when there's midge pupae in the water. But you need something for a small, slim mayfly, and that's what's hatching. Also imitates a small, slim stonefly, the early black stones. So it's a great wintertime fly, and I just think it's more effective in this slimmer version than the bulkier version. The bulkier version certainly works well, but it's not really. I don't consider it really a pheasant tail. Hand pink waving. I don't know what that means. I'm just reading a comment from Samuel. Maybe somebody can explain that to me. I'm a little naive. I don't get out much. Anyway, so but I tie mine differently. And one of the things about the original pheasant tail nymph is it's not very durable. And yeah, you can put epoxy and stuff like that on it or super glue, but there are ways to tie the pheasant tail without adding any epoxy to make it sink better and to make it more durable. And So that's why I tie my pheasant tails a little bit differently. So let's get started. And Julia's not here today. Phil Monahan is going to be reading the questions out and answering them and working in the background. So anyway, let's start. So I'm using a size 16 standard 2x long nymph hook, just a standard barb 2x long nymph hook, and I'll usually pinch the barb on this. And for this fly, I like to use 2 black tungsten beads, and I like them smaller than you'd put on a particular hook size. So I've got a couple of small tungsten beads, and I don't even know what size they are on this 16 hook. I just eyeball them, and I want those 2 beads to kind of cover what's going to be the thorax. So I just kind of eyeball them and say, okay, yeah, it's going to be about the thorax. And if you really want to know what size beads I'm using, you can use this handy dandy hairline bead gauge, and I think that these are 5/64. Yeah, because if I move it into the 3/32, it'll fall through. Okay, so these are 5/64 beads, and I am going to slide them on the hook. Really doesn't matter which way, but I like to put the I'm going to have to do this off camera because I got to look at them closely here. So I like to put the narrow end up against the hook eye, or the beads have a small hole and a big hole, and I like to put the hook through the small hole. So I've got that first bead on, and then the second one, I kind of like to put it through the big hole so that the small hole is facing the tying thread. So there's my hook with the beads on it. Let's go over to the vise and secure our hook in there. You can debarb your fly now or later. And the first thing you're going to do is you're going to push those beads back out of the way. And you're going to start your thread right about in the middle. And I am using 12-0 brown thread. I really like for anything, even size 14 and smaller, I really like 12-0 thread. I can get a lot more turns without building up bulk. So anyway, there is my thread started in the middle. And then I'm going to take some pheasant tail fibers. And this is the wing case. I'm going to put the wing case on first. And you're probably going to want about 8 or 10 fibers of pheasant tail. And I'm going to cut those off the pheasant tail. So I've got a bunch of pheasant tail fibers. And then you always want to trim the ends off pheasant tail to even them up, and also because those ends are really weak. So I'm just gonna take those weak ends off the front of it. Then I'm going to come back and I'm going to flip my pheasant tail around so that the fine ends are the part I'm going to tie in. So I'm just going to start and wind these down nice and tight and I'm going to try to keep them on top. You might have to scooch them back a little bit. And I'm going to wind these all the way up to the hook eye. All the way up to it, right to the eye. Right to there. And then you usually have to go back and just bind under these pieces of pheasant tail. And then you're going to take your beads and slip them up over your tying thread, like so. And then there's two things you could do. You could either whip finish here and reattach your thread behind the beads if you want. But if you cross the thread on top of the beads carefully, that thread's gonna stay hidden. So it's not gonna be exposed. I just generally do it like that. So I've crossed the thread over the top of the beads. And then you're going to bring your wing case. So you can see this is kind of a reverse of the way you'd usually tie the pheasant tail. You bring your wing case over the top, secure it right behind the beads. And trim it off. Like so. Bind those ends down. Oh, the other thing that I do for my pheasant tails is I use bronze mallard for the tails. Now, pheasant tail itself is not very durable, and the original called for tails of pheasant tail. But I like a piece of bronze mallard. It matches well with the color of the body. You may not have any bronze mallard because, let me zoom this in a little bit. You may not have any bronze mallard because it's a difficult feather to find. There's only a few of them on a mallard duck, and unless you hunt ducks or unless you tie salmon flies or steelhead flies, you probably don't have any bronze mallard. You can use ginger grizzly hackle fibers. You could use coq de leon, any speckled feather, or you could use pheasant tail, but or you can use wood duck. But you want some kind of speckled feather that's a little more durable than pheasant tail. And you don't need many fibers, half a dozen or so for this, and then even them up while they're still on the feather. Cut them off. And then I like my tail short on a pheasant tail, so I am going to just let them extend about that much. I'll line them up there, and I will pull them to my side. And you want to keep these pulled a little bit to your side, even at the end, because the way I wind this pheasant tail, when you first start winding, it tends to creep the fibers over to the far side. So keep them a little bit on your side for a minute. And then you can trim that. Phil, are there any questions so far?
There are a few.
Okay.
They're kind of general questions. Is there a difference between a wet fly hook and a nymph hook?
It depends on who labeled the hooks. Typically, a wet fly hook has a standard shank. In other words, it's going to be the same shank length. A size 14 wet fly hook is going to have about the same shank length as a size 14 dry fly hook. That's kind of the standard. Some wet fly hooks are what's called 1x short. They're a little shorter than normal. typically nymphs are tied. They can be tied on a wet fly hook. No reason they can't be. But typically nymphs are tied on 2x long and 3x long hooks. So they're a little bit longer shank in relation to the hook gap or the hook size. But it really doesn't matter.
Okay. And Steve says, why not wrap the thread back before you slide the beads forward?
Why not wrap the thread back?
Yeah, I'm not sure I get that one.
No, I'm not sure either. I don't know. This is the way I do it. taking the easy way out. That's the way I do it.
All right.
Okay.
I think that's it for now.
Okay. Okay. Now we're going to take our pheasant tail again and take about, I don't know, maybe 6 fibers, not too many. 4, 5, 6 fibers. This is going to be the body. And we're going to do the same thing. Going to trim those ends just to even them up. And we're going to tie them in. And I'm going to lay them in there, tie it in, line forward to the front, to the thorax. Then I'm going to take a piece of very fine copper wire. This one is this is the extra fine, extra small ultra wire. Sometimes used to make your own dubbing brushes, but just use the finest piece of copper wire you can find. And I'm just going to grab a small section of that wire. And I'm going to start up here where I ended my body and just wind that in all the way back. And then I'm going to make a loop with my tying thread. So I'm just making a loop and winding over it. Give it a little lock there. And then wind forward. So what you have now is you have a loop of tying thread, a piece of copper wire, and those strands of pheasant tail all together. And you want to hold them in your hand until they're nice and tight. And then just twist them with your fingers. Just roll them like you would dubbing and twist them. That's going to twist that tying thread and the pheasant tail fibers and the copper wire all together, make a nice durable bundle. And then just wind that forward. And I twist a little bit as I wind. So I make a wind, I retwist it, I make a wind, I retwist it, make a wind, retwist it, whoops, and go all the way up to the thorax. And tie that in. Get out of there, copper wire. Tie that in. 3 good tight turns. Trim it off. Use the middle of your scissors or the inside of them. They're far down in because you are cutting a piece of wire, even though it's very fine wire. You don't want to use your good scissors to do that. And then you just take a few more turns to secure it. Whip finish. And then you're gonna want to add just a drop of head cement, which I forgot to bring over to my tying area. Just put a drop of head cement right over the place where everything was tied down. Right there. Now, if you really wanted to, you could put some epoxy over the top of that wing case. I don't think you need to, and I don't like the looks of it, but you could. And there you've got a pheasant tail that's going to sink better than a normal pheasant tail, yet it doesn't have that big, bulky, flashy bead up front. It does, it looks more like a little mayfly or a stonefly nymph. It's nice and slim. It's got enough weight so it'll get down there, and it's going to be very durable. Fish can chew on that body pretty good. And that wing case, because the ends are both buried underneath, the wing case is going to be a lot less likely to tear loose when you're playing a fish or just when you're casting. So that's it.
So we got a couple of questions, Tom.
Okay.
How small will you tie this?
Oh, good. Yeah, good question. I tie them. I tie them as big as a 14, and I tie them as small as an 18. It's hard to get black tungsten beads smaller than that. So, yeah. So 14 through 18.
Does the direction you twist the fibers when you're wrapping that rope matter?
Only to Tim Flagler. I don't think so. As long as you twist them.
Okay.
Tim Flagler would tell you that it needs to be clockwise or counterclockwise, but I don't think
Roger wants to know if that's a dubbing loop without the dubbing.
Yeah, it's a dubbing loop without the dubbing. Exactly. It's just there to help strengthen the pheasant tail, because fibers tend to break and then they stick out, and the fly. And I find a lot of flies work better when they're chewed, like a hare's ear nymph. It's been caught a few fish, it gets chewed up and it fishes better. And it may be in my imagination, but I've found if the fibers start to stick out of a pheasant tail, it doesn't work as well.
And Rick wants to know, what about the wing/beard that the pheasant tail is supposed to have?
There is no wing and there is no beard on a standard pheasant tail. There's two reasons that Frank Sawyer didn't put legs or beard or anything on a pheasant tail. One is that when you have legs sticking out from the side, it retards the sink rate. The fly doesn't sink as quickly. The other thing is that these small skinny mayfly nymphs that you're imitating, if you look in the water, something like a Baetis nymph, a blue-wing olive nymph, or some of the small thin mayfly nymphs, you can't even see their legs. They're so insignificant. I mean, you might as well start worrying about imitating their eyes and their antennae if you worry about imitating the legs. So, a true original pheasant tail, it didn't have any kind of wing or beard, just a wing case.
And Mika wants to know if you use a bamboo fly rod when you fish this.
Sometimes I do fish bamboo. I have a couple of bamboo rods that I love, and I do sometimes. Yeah. Wouldn't the standard Frank Sawyer method of tying with wire only be less durable? Yeah, I think it's less durable, Ed. Because I buried all this stuff under the beads, I think and I twisted it with tying thread as well as with wire. I think it's more durable.
Ooh, Andy wants to know if you tie a jig version.
Nope. You could. You very well could. No, you couldn't. Wouldn't look the same. You might as well just tie a pheasant tail jig. You couldn't. No, you couldn't, because I don't think you could get two tiny slotted beads over a jig hook. I'm not sure. I haven't tried it because I like the profile with the straight shank on this particular nymph. You don't need to tie everything with a jig hook, but you could attempt it. Again, I haven't tried it, so I'm not sure.
Sean says, where's the best place to use this app? I assume he means this fly. Where's the best place to use this fly?
Yeah, this fly will work in nearly any kind of water, but it's a very effective fly in slower water, because that's where a lot of these skinny swimming nymphs live, water with a lot of weeds. So spring creeks, tailwaters. But on the other hand, I use it effectively on tumbling brook trout streams and big brawling rivers like the Madison, or the pocket water on the Henry's Fork. So, it'll work just about anywhere, but it'll probably work better than a lot of standard nymphs in slower current, which is what you're going to be fishing this time of year, if you're fishing during the winter.
Do you fish it alone or usually as part of a tandem rig?
Yeah, if I get away with it, I'll use two nymphs usually, but I often fish dry dropper, except for wintertime. But yeah, I'll fish it with another nymph. And if it's if it's wintertime and it's a tailwater, I'd fish this with a little tiny midge pupil, like a zebra midge or something. And if it was more spring, summertime, and I was fishing bigger water, I'd probably fish it with a bigger, heavier nymph and use this as the smaller fly, the tail fly or the dropper. Depends on the water and the time of year.
So Josh wonders, is it too heavy to fish under a dry fly, or do you use you probably use your chubby, don't you? Your chubby Chernobyl to float this.
Yeah, this one it's relatively heavy. You could probably float it with like a size 14 parachute Adams, because it's not super clunking. It slibs, so it sinks well, but it's not super heavy. So yeah, I would say you could fish it under a dry fly. I mean, you wouldn't want to fish it under like a size 14 Catskill Hendrickson or something like that, but under an elk hair caddis or a parachute Haresy or parachute Adams, yeah, it would work. Wouldn't sink them.
Do you only tie it with black beads, or do you use other colors as well?
I only tie it with black beads. That doesn't mean you can't tie it with any colored beads you want, including pink. I do. This is a fly that I use in clear water when I want something a little more subtle, and I maybe heavily fished waters, and I don't want that flash of a gold bead. I got plenty of flies in my fly box with flashy gold beads, and so this is one I use for an alternative to the flashier flies. I think you do need some more subtle nymphs in your box that don't have bright gold or copper shiny beads in front of them.
All right. I think that covers most of our questions.
Wow. That was a quick one. I think it was a quick one. Yeah, pretty quick. Next Monday, we're going to tie a saltwater fly. We're going to tie a mushmouth, which I haven't tied in a while, so I got to practice. But mushmouth is a great saltwater pattern, bait fish pattern. So you could use it in freshwater for bass and even for trout. But it's developed as a saltwater imitation by the great fly tyer Dave Skoke. So anyway, we'll tie that next week.
Of course, as soon as I say no more questions come floating in. Do you fish it under an indicator when you're fishing it, or do you fish it naked?
I do sometimes. Again, to you don't want to back yourself into a corner and say, I fish it with an indicator. You fish it based on what the conditions are. So let's say I'm fishing in clear water and I can see fish in the water feeding on nymphs. I can actually see them eating nymphs underwater, and I can sneak up to them with a long fine leader. I'll sight fish them with this fly with no indicator, no dry fly, no nothing. And I'll watch the fish. I'll watch the fish's reaction when if a fish moves, when I think a fly is in the vicinity, I'll gently set the hook. So you can sight fish it naked without anything. There are times when, if I think the fish might come up for a dry fly, I'll fish it with a dry dropper, usually a bigger dry, foam dry. And then if it's early season, the water's high, and I might want to fish this with a bigger, heavier fly, and I just can't float those two heavy flies with a dry fly, then I'll use an indicator. But I find more and more I fish dry dropper and throughout most of the season instead of using an indicator. And of course, you could Euro nymph with it too. So, don't pigeonhole yourself. Don't back yourself into a corner. Fish it based on the conditions you experience when you get to the water. Be flexible. Is there any need to include the legs on pheasant tails? Bill, I don't think so. I don't think so. Again, these skinny little nymphs, if you look at them underwater, the legs are insignificant. So the fish don't seem to care that it has no legs. It doesn't have eyeballs, doesn't have antennae, and it's got like 6 legs instead of 3, but the fish still eat it. So, it's enough of an impression. It's enough of a silhouette for the fish to think it's food. That's all you want to do. I'd love to see your version of a Lefty's Deceiver. Well, my version of Lefty's Deceiver is exactly the way Lefty tied him. So I don't know if you've seen an original Lefty's Deceiver, then you're going to see the same way I tie him. And I got instructions from him on exactly how he ties them. So I tie him exactly the way Lefty did. Line leader and/or tippet for the best performance. Well, again, PLS, it's going to depend on conditions. I can't tell you what the best line leader and so on. I would generally use floating line, 12-foot leader with a 5X tippet on this particular fly. But, it's going to depend. It depends on what you're faced with when you hit the river. It's always going to be different. Does a double bead sink much faster than a single bead fly? I don't know. I haven't measured it, Mike. But I want a slim fly, and I want it fairly heavy. And the only way I can get it fairly heavy and tie a slim fly is with these 2 smaller beads. So it's probably about, I don't know, you could weigh them if you want on a gram scale. I don't have a gram scale, but it's probably about the same as 1 big bead. Okay. I think we got them all now, Phil, right?
Yep.
Okay. All right, everyone. Well, thank you for tuning in. Really appreciate it. If you're new, welcome. I hope I gave you some ideas on tying flies a little bit differently, and especially on tying the pheasant tail a little bit differently. Try these out. You'll find that they last longer. And yes, you can tie them with legs. You can tie them with 1 bead. You could tie them with gold beads. Go right ahead and experiment. This is the way I tie them, and I'll probably experiment with those things too. But until then, this one's working just fine for me. So thanks, everyone, and we will see you next Monday.